Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping straight into a deep dive on the historical roots of the Sri Lankan conflict. Now, we aren't just going to sit here and list off dates and names like a textbook. Instead, we're going to examine how compounding historical layers, things like geography, colonial intervention, and massive demographic shifts, actually created an environment practically engineered for conflict. It's an incredible story of how the past inevitably collided with the present, so let's get right into it. So, here is the core question that's going to drive our entire analysis today. How exactly did history shape conflict in Sri Lanka? Think of this whole explanation as a cumulative equation. We are going to build, layer by layer, the cause and effect relationship between ancient settlements, colonial policy, and modern political grievances. Every single piece of history we look at today is an absolutely vital building block to understanding the true origins of this unrest. To answer that question, we're going to follow a clear timeline. First up, ancient roots. 2, colonial transformation. 3, the independence era. 4, post-independence issues. And finally, 5, the final framework. Part 1, ancient roots, the foundations of identity. Okay, let's wind the clock way back. The documented history here starts with Aryan colonizers arriving from regions like Bihar and Bengal. They formed Sinhalese kingdoms, most notably Anuradhapura in the north, by the 4th century BC. Then, right around the 3rd century BC, a massive island-altering cultural shift happens. Emperor Ashoka sends his son, the monk Mahindra, to introduce Buddhism, and it absolutely flourished, becoming the established religion and giving the Sinhalese this profound sense of national identity. But history doesn't just sit still. Fast forward to the 12th century AD, and a crucial shift occurs. Tamil invaders from Tamil Nadu arrived, and they forced the Sinhalese to withdraw south. This actually marked the beginning of Tamil domination in the northern and eastern parts of the island, physically splitting the demographic map. Oh, and we definitely can't forget that before the 16th century, Arab traders arrived, introducing Islam and settling across the country, mostly in the east. Now, what's really important to grasp here is that these early migrations didn't just casually blend together into one giant melting pot. No, they settled into very distinct geographical pockets. Because of those incursions and migrations, for a huge chunk of history, the island was actually ruled by 2 completely separate sets of kings. You had Sinhala kings in the major southern portion, and Tamil kings up in the north and parts of the east. The physical geography of the island was quite literally split by these distinct identities. Which brings us to part 2, colonial transformation, the catalyst. Sri Lanka saw a really rapid succession of European powers, and every single one left a deep mark. First, the Portuguese arrived in 1505. They were heavily focused on monopolizing the spice trade. They managed to conquer the kingdom of Jaffna, but they just couldn't dislodge the Sinhalese kingdom in Kandy. Then, in 1658, with the help of Kandy actually, the Dutch expelled the Portuguese. The Dutch were mostly interested in trade and profit along the coasts. Finally, the British showed up in 1796. And here is the crucial turning point. By 1815, the British achieved what literally no other European power had managed. They wore down the sovereignty of Kandy and conquered the entire island. This British conquest completely rewired Sri Lanka. Previously, there had been 3 totally separate administrative systems, the Sinhalese Maritime, the Tamil Maritime, and the Kandyan provinces. But in 1833, the British abolished all of them. They forced integration by creating a single, unitary administrative and judicial system. And on top of that administrative unification, the British completely transformed the economy. They developed massive tea, coffee, and cinnamon plantations right in the Central Highlands. To work these plantations, starting around 1837, they imported an enormous workforce from India. These laborers became known as Indian Tamils, which is a group distinctly separate from the native Sri Lankan Tamils. To put that demographic shift into perspective, this imported workforce eventually numbered over 1 million people. Let's move to part 3. The independence era, expectation versus reality. So the British had essentially mashed together these historically disparate groups under one administrative roof and radically altered the demographics. When independence finally loomed, on paper, the expectation was national unity. And actually, for a brief moment, it looks like it might work. In 1919, the Ceylon National Congress was formed, and it successfully united Sinhala and Tamil organizations to struggle together for independence. But as political consciousness grew across the island, the reality of ethnic competition quickly set in. Sinhalese leaders wanted universal territorial representation, while minority groups wanted to retain communal representation to make sure they actually had secured power for their own communities. These fissures deepened right as the 1947 Ceylon Independence Act was passed, conferring dominion status, with full independence arriving in February 1948. To really understand why these fissures were so deep, we have to look objectively at the demographics. By the late 80s, the island had a population of 17 million people. It's a mixed demographic for sure, but it is heavily skewed. The Sinhalese make up a massive majority at 73.8%. The Sri Lankan Tamils sit at 12.7%. The Indian Tamils, again originally brought over for those British plantations, at 5.5%, and Muslims at 7.1%. Now, layer the religious composition on top of that, and you'll see it closely mirrors the ethnic lines, which just further compounds these distinct identities. 67.4% are Buddhist, which is largely that Sinhalese majority, while 17.6% are Hindu, aligning almost perfectly with the Tamil populations. Christians and Muslims make up the rest. So we aren't just talking about ethnic differences here. You have deeply entrenched religious divides aligning perfectly with those exact same ethnicities. When you compare the ethnic concentrations with the linguistic data, the correlation is incredibly vivid. The Sinhalese majority, speaking Sinhala, dominates the vast majority of the island. Meanwhile, the Tamil minority, speaking Tamil, is intensely concentrated in the northern province and parts of the eastern province. It's the stark visual reminder of how those ancient geographical settlements we talked about earlier survived right into the modern era. Part 4. Post-independence issues, policies, and grievances. Once the British left the picture, the newly independent nation attempted to use political power to address some historical imbalances. You see, the Sinhalese majority looked at the socio-economic landscape and saw a massive skew. During colonial rule, Christian missionaries had been widely welcomed into Tamil areas. Because of this, Tamils benefited enormously from much better education. And, well, that translated directly into jobs. In the colonial era, Tamils actually held a disproportionate number of the blue and white-collar jobs. They developed a higher standard of living and a highly articulate, politically conscious middle class. After independence, the Sinhalese majority government arbitrarily sought to correct this imbalance, and they did it through a series of very blunt, majority-oriented legislative measures. First, the ruling United National Party redefined citizenship, which effectively disenfranchised 1 million Indian Tamil plantation workers, suddenly making them stateless. Next, they declared Sinhalese as the only official language, and conferred special constitutional protection for Buddhism. Finally, they began a direct policy of colonization, resettling Sinhala families into predominantly Tamil areas to intentionally alter the demographic pattern. As you might expect, the resulting fallout from these policies was absolutely devastating. Educational and job opportunities for Tamils and other minorities were suddenly reduced, shifting away from a merit-based system. Mutual distrust deepened rapidly across the board. The Sinhalas felt Tamils didn't consider themselves true Sri Lankans, while Tamils felt entirely ostracized, their language and culture officially unrecognized. Even attempts at diplomacy failed. A 1964 pact with India to repatriate 500,000 of those stateless Tamil laborers, it died a natural death because Sri Lanka suddenly realized that losing that workforce would completely destroy their tea industry. And then we hit the absolute breaking point. In 1973, police violently broke into the World Tamil Conference in Jaffna. 9 people were killed, over 50 were injured, and there was widespread looting of Tamil heritage and property. This single event acted as a catastrophic catalyst for the conflict. Which leads us to Part 5. The final framework. If we look back at everything we've covered, the core dynamic breaks down into a compounding equation. You take deep-seated historical identity from ancient kingdoms and religions. You add the sweeping changes in political power and forced administrative unification by the British. You mix in the volatile demography of imported labor and heavily concentrated ethnic regions. And finally, you spark it with economics, those colonial job imbalances violently corrected by post-independence policies. Add all of those elements together, and you have a perfectly engineered conflict environment. Our source material actually sums this up with a really poignant and, frankly, tragic observation. It says, the dawn of independence saw the reappearance of ethnic discord which the historical roots had created. It's like a pressure cooker. The colonial era, with its iron grip and divide-and-rule tactics, had merely kept these ancient, deep-seated historical roots temporarily in check. The very moment that pressure was released at independence, the historical fault lines completely ruptured. Which leaves us with one final pretty provocative question to chew on. When political solutions fail to balance deep historical identities, is conflict truly inevitable? The long, powerful shadow of history is undeniable here. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep analyzing, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.